This week, Adam Gordon from IT Pro TV joins us for an interview about his 130 certifications. I'm joking. Rebecca Brown from Rapid7 comes on the show to celebrate her birthday. And what a better place to celebrate your birthday than with Security Weekly, I guess? I don't know. Maybe.
Then Jack should have been here because it's his birthday too.
And happy birthday, Jack Daniel. Bind comes apart thanks to an ancient denial of service vulnerability. Text bombing is yet another thing for Apple to deal with. YouTube raises a subscriber viewer threshold, which I thought was interesting. There's the potent SkyGo free malware and Microsoft Office vulnerabilities, as well as Zyklon malware. So we'll talk about all that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, excited to be here, as always, on Paul's Security Weekly.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I totally introduced our host right now, but I've got a totally awkward boner.
What? Where? Oh, hey! I'm in the studio with you guys. That's kind of cool.
Sounds like a plan.
And we'll at least have one person listening.
That's right. Just
yeah, I know, and I appreciate it, and I'm glad you enjoyed your spooning with Jeff. But you know,
hey, that's
actually built a new office.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, third baby on the way, so I needed a new office.
Nice.
I lost my old office. That's now the baby room.
So, brought to you by... The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man that, well, insists that we no longer discuss the Thanksgiving incident, even though it has made him popular in certain circles. Paul Asadorian.
No talking about the Thanksgiving incident. I think we should just carry that as kind of like a thing on the show, that it will forever be known as the Thanksgiving incident. We will never describe the Thanksgiving
First
incident.
rule of Thanksgiving incident.
First rule of Thanksgiving incident is we'll never talk about...
The first rule of Thanksgiving incident is that you have to get drunk enough to forget the Thanksgiving incident.
Well, and I you know what? I'm not even going to say anymore. You know what? You know what? I'm not going to do it. Not going to do it. Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode 544 for January 18th, 2018. And it's Thursday night, so it's time for Paul's Security Weekly. In studio, to my left is none other than Mr. Larry Pesci. I made you a dirty martini, by the way. I don't know if you noticed that.
I saw. Haven't had
Do you
a
like
chance.
those? I couldn't remember how much you liked those or not.
They were okay, but the last one you made was really good, so I was willing
Hopefully
to try
this
it
one's
again.
equally as good.
I was willing to try it again. So what do they say? Try it once if you like it. Try it once, twice if you like it.
Yes. Yes.
So.
Awesome.
There we go.
Mr. Michael Santarcangelo is here in studio. Look at that. And there's unicorns behind you.
Then my day's complete.
Unicorn.
My daughters are going to be happy.
Unicorn behind you.
They're going to be like, Daddy, did you put that unicorn there? And
They're going to be like, why didn't you take it home? Because it's mine.
Yeah.
Okay? It's mine. I mean, I love you.
But can I
by
pet
extension,
it?
I love
I can
your
pet
friend.
it before I leave, right?
You can totally touch it, but you just can't take it home with you.
I'll take a picture of it.
Yeah, you can take pictures of it. You can take pictures with it.
Ooh.
Just can't take it home.
I can
Even my own children ask me, Dad, can I take... No, it's mine.
Yep. Right,
unicorn.
I'll take a picture. It'll last longer.
Speaking of unicorns, on the line via Skype, Mr. Keith Hoodlet is here. Keith, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here. I don't have anything to say to that. I'm just thank you.
How do you like that for a transition? Unicorns.
I'm a rare breed of security-curious developers. What can I say?
Wow. All right.
Make sure you check out our on-demand material because it's awesome. Why is it so awesome, Michael? I always turn to you for this.
I know, and we talked today. I need to go differentiate some of that a little bit, but here's the way that I'm looking at the on-demand material that we have now and the on-demand material that we're planning and we're going to add into it. There's a lot of times that you want to go get insight on a topic to make a better decision, and you need time to think about it or you want to understand it better. That's what our on-demand program is designed for. And what I like too is what we're going to be bringing forward. So what we put up there now is content from the last year that we liked, and you can come sample it on demand. What we're going to with our on-demand program is looking at a particular topic and then giving you multiple viewpoints on it. Gives you a chance to make better decisions, or so we think. I mean, to be fair too, if you check it out, let us know what you'd like to see on demand, or let us know how it helps you. Let us talk to us about that stuff, and we'll get you hooked up.
Fantastic. Everybody's landtastic. Remember that line?
Oh, God. Fantastic.
So, I think that's it for announcements. So, I don't need that anymore. And now I can introduce our special guest for this evening. Adam Gordon is returning to the show from IT Pro TV. I'm pretty sure you remember Landtastic as well, Adam. Is that true?
I do.
We've just terrified him.
Yeah, that's right.
He's like, what did I just sign up?
He's like,
no. I just lost my earpiece. Just came out
worries.
for a second. I just heard you, then I lost you.
Adam's like, I didn't come on the show to talk about Landtastic. Not gonna do it.
Well, that is reaching way back into the vault of old school networking, along with Banyan Vines and
yes.
Probably Street Talk.
So, Adam, let's talk about kind of early on in your career how you got involved in the field of IT.
So great, absolutely. I came into it, and I guess people that perhaps are around my age may have a point of reference for this. But I didn't actually start out wanting to do IT, shockingly enough. And I say that only because I love what I do, and I love what I do and have done for over 30 years in IT. But I didn't go to school to learn how to do what I do. Back in the 1980s, when I was getting out of high school, getting into college, graduating from college, you couldn't go to school and learn to do what any of us do. And if you're of a certain age in our field, you are either self-taught or self-motivated, and you learned on the job. And when I went to school, becoming an engineer involved being an electrical engineer, right? The only kind of engineer you really could become at that point in time. Now you can go study, whether it's in a formal program, in college or wherever it may be, and major in IS or get a master's degree in information sciences or whatever. But back then, I was self-taught. I built my own first computer and kind of learned how to do coding on my own and just got into it in dribs and drabs and fits and starts. And one thing led to another, and here I am over 30 years later with what I think is the best job in the world, teaching and talking about all the cool IT stuff I get to do on a regular basis.
You do have a really cool job. Adam, what was missing in those early days when you were self-teaching? Like, when you look back on that, what did you wish that you had in terms of resources or help in those times?
Aside from IT Pro TV?
Shameless plug. And that's kind of where that was somewhat of a leading. Yeah. Okay, it was a leading question.
No, it was, but it's also a great question. And aside from the obvious, right, which are a variety of resources that we could take advantage of, like online formats and learning modalities such as IT Pro TV. But aside from things like that, at the time I was, and I still am, a voracious reader. So I read and interacted with all sorts of different pieces of information. But back then, in the mid to late, even early to mid 1980s, as I was really getting into what was the burgeoning field of IT back then, there wasn't the kind of internet resources we have today. I mean, smart devices didn't really exist at all, and computers were just becoming somewhat commonplace and available to the average person, laptops, desktops, things like that. I went to school and got into college before you really had access to computers, except if you were using them at school because somebody had spent thousands of dollars to buy one. And I remember, writing term papers and doing all that kind of stuff on typewriters and word processors before computers became commonplace, as some of you listening to this, or in general people, around a certain age will remember. And I think the biggest thing that was missing was the ability to get a lot of resources in a very easily consumable format and easily accessible format. I had to work really hard, as all of us did at that time, to figure out how to do things, because nobody was there centrally located, sharing their knowledge, doing podcasts, things like this. None of this existed. I mean, this is all relatively new. We take it all for granted today, but 15, 20, 30 years ago, it was a very different world. And if you didn't understand how to go to a library and how to look things up the old-fashioned way and read them in a book and then go figure it out, you didn't learn. And so for me, I came up in a very different time, learning a very different way. And I love the fact I can learn in a lot of different ways today, but I wish I had been able to do that at the beginning of my career. I just think about how much different in terms of what I'm able to do now, how much more I could have done,
Adam,
and the access to resources I would have had.
Adam, for aspiring information security professionals today, what are some of your top book recommendations?
So I think in terms of security, which is one of the things I spend a lot of time on, I think anything that Bruce Schneider has written, the history of cryptography, and things of that nature that are foundational elements in what we do, I think are really important. I think one of the most important things for any security professional, aside from the common stuff, right, stuff like that, keeping up with all the modern stuff, I find a lot of times I talk to IT and security professionals, and they don't have a really good grasp and understanding and grounding of some of the basics of what maybe some of us take for granted. Basic networking knowledge, things like the OSI model and how it works, why it works, and the way it does work, and networking overall. And so I think understanding basic networking and basic functional concepts about how things communicate is one of the most important things that I build my knowledge base on every day.
That was really interesting because
Richard Stevens, TCP/IP Illustrated Volume 1 would be a requirement on your reading list.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have it not on my bookshelf back here because I'm in Don's office. As you know, we're borrowing his office to do the interview, but in my own collection, I actually have that book.
So I was having a conversation with someone on Twitter just the other day, and it came down to that they weren't being taught the OSI model in college because the specific instructors thought that the OSI model was a waste of time. And what? I use the OSI model 3 times a week. And we had to steer them in the right direction. I see it with a lot of
my students. I do see it. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean to cut you off. Just I see it in class with a lot of my students. I do a lot of teaching for VMware, for instance, right? As a VMware certified instructor for Microsoft, as a certified trainer for them for the case in Microsoft over 20 years now, and historically over that time, you get a student in a beginning class. I take it for granted they may not know it, but when they get into more advanced topics, we kind of assume some knowledge, and oftentimes we assume incorrectly as teachers because they may not know. And I find a lot of times students didn't benefit from the fact that somebody sat them down and took the time to teach it to them and teach it to them the right way, whether it's the OSI model or what an IP address is and how we figure out what an octet is and all that kind of basic stuff. And it handicaps you later on. It just really makes it much more difficult for you to do what you need to do correctly in the workplace.
How important is getting a mentor, in your opinion, Adam?
I think it's invaluable. I think for what any of us look to do in this industry with it changing so quickly, especially today, how things are continuously changing, and it's this one day and it's something the next. If you don't have somebody who can help guide you and help you to figure out what you need to focus on and what may or may not be pertinent to what you're looking to develop yourself to do professionally, I think you're at a great disadvantage compared to other people that have that. And I think it's very difficult to break into our industry in general because people look for experience, but they don't want to give you the chance to build it. And I think a mentor helps bridge a lot of those gaps and fill in those concerns with the right kind of guidance and the right kind of information that helps you to move forward in some respects.
Adam, did you choose to focus on Microsoft technologies, or did the technologies choose you?
So it was a combination of me getting my job initially that kind of got me moving into IT, and the focus of that job that got me interested in and focused on Microsoft. So in the beginning, it was job driven because the job required that I understand those things. But as I got more into it and I learned to do more of it, I became interested in it of my own, and I broadened my focus. I work with Exchange, with SharePoint, with cloud technologies, with virtualization in the Microsoft stack, and I support a lot of those technologies as an in-the-field specialist. So I really now create my own path because of the time I've spent doing it. But in the beginning, It was because my employer said, hey, by the way, we hired you to do this. Figure it out.
Michael, do you have a question?
Well, I think a lot of people, when we talk about mentors, the common question is, how do I find one? I'm more curious, how do you be one? I mean, like when you talk about the importance of a good mentor, what does it take to be a good mentor?
So it's a great question. I actually, because of some of the work I do, certainly here with IT Pro TV, talking with our customers and people that are engaging with us around the content we're creating, have more of an opportunity now recently than I have in the last several years to do that and act as a mentor. But I found that being on LinkedIn and being open to connecting with students, with people that I have done work with or that I've taught, opened up that opportunity for me in terms of how do you become one. In terms of being a good mentor, I think you need to be willing to share your experiences. I think you need to be willing to open up and offer guidance to people that are starting out that may know less than you or want to know more about things you do. I think most importantly, you need to be approachable. You know, when people approach me on LinkedIn, and I often encourage my students and my customers and people in our studio audiences to do that, when they send me an invitation, if it's not a sales related invitation, I'm not looking to, say yes to you because you want to sell me something. I don't need that. But if you're genuinely interested in connecting with me, you want to network and share knowledge, or in some cases maybe form a mentor type relationship, and you're honest with me about what your intentions are, hey, I'm looking to connect with you, hoping you could give me some guidance on this. I had one gentleman reach out to me this past week, actually, who said, hey, I've seen your name about doing certain things. You've written books, you've done this, you're involved in these areas, you're on IT Pro TV. I'm getting out of the military in 9 months. I'm active military now. I'm looking to get out in 9 months. I'm looking to change my career focus when I get out. I'm interested in getting into IT and IT services and security. And I was hoping someone like you with your skill set and your background could offer me some career guidance. Would you be interested in doing that? And that was roughly the gist of, the message he sent. And I responded immediately. I said, absolutely. And, let's try to figure that out because, I think that's important. And I think those kinds of connections are part of the responsibility we have if we're active in our community and want to see it continue and get better over time.
I think that's a great point too. If we're serious about this community and we're serious about raising it up and leveling it up, we have got to share that knowledge, especially if we're finding people don't have it right now, or they're not getting that training. Or what's the other thing we talk about? How often, Adam, do you find that some of the folks are book smart, but they lack that practical experience?
More often than I would care to find or readily care to qualify, but it's very often, unfortunately.
Now, Adam, I would have thought by your beard that you would have been a Linux or Unix person, because that's just a stereotype that I have, to be quite honest. However, when I look at IT today and I assess the number of people that have a very deep knowledge of Unix or Linux, and then when I look at Active Directory and I see the varying depths of knowledge, in your opinion, are there differences there? Are there a smaller number of people that have a really, truly deep knowledge of Active Directory versus Linux, Unix? And if so, why is that?
So I think there's probably, today, I think if we had this conversation, let's say maybe 5 years ago approximately or so, I think it would have been a little bit different. But I think today, because of the prevalence of cloud technologies and the advent of, whether it's Microsoft in this case, because we're talking about Microsoft Active Directory, but generically cloud providers that are offering directory services as part of their catalog of offerings, right? Some sort of LDAP-based solution. And because they're making it so easy to set up and so easy to manage, and they're taking a lot of the burden and the headache and the liability away from IT professionals that have to do it on-prem, I think it's changing, and I think we're seeing unfortunately, an atrophying of the knowledge base around certain key knowledge like we were talking about. And I think cloud services, for all the good they do and all the good that we talk about them enabling, are also doing, unfortunately, some damage, which is they're forcing businesses to think about reskilling and redistributing their skill inventory. And I don't think businesses are always doing a great job of figuring out what to do with those IT talents and put them to better use. We talked a bit about this in the last show we did around virtualization hypervisors as well. But I do think, to answer your question directly, as a result, I think there's a lot of people that think they know a lot about AD and think they know a lot about how to manage it today, but because they're not doing it as often on-prem, meaning in their own house, doing it with their own infrastructure, and more of this is being outsourced to the cloud, I think we're seeing that less and less of that skill set is actually functional, whereas it's really just surface-based. Oh, I know the Active Directory. I can create a user. I can create a group. But when you get into how to really drill down and how to deal with structure, architecture, scalability, and management, I think we're lacking in those skills.
Some of the skills gap derived from administrators today, whether that be Linux, Unix, or Active Directory in Windows, don't have to install the operating system on a slab of bare iron anymore?
More often than not, no. I do have a Linux Unix background, although it's not something I would claim to be an expert in by any means. But I do have a functional and fairly deep background there because I spent a lot of time there over the years for customers. But I learned that the hard way, like we talked about, by doing it hands-on. I learned the things that I do and I claim to be knowledgeable about on a regular basis by doing it, if not every day, almost every day. And in the cloud or even on-prem today, you can automate almost anything with desired state configuration, with a DevOps mindset generically, and with scripting and management platforms like Puppet or Chef or Salt or whatever you're using. And I think people are becoming really good at understanding how to leverage automation platforms to do things. I don't think they're really good at understanding what they're doing as a result of that. And as I said, I think those skills are shifting and people are becoming really good at writing code that lets you take the human out of the mix, but they're not really good at understanding the risks of managing that infrastructure once it's provisioned because they don't understand how to really manage it correctly. And I think that's the challenge over time.
Yeah, I tend to think that there's a big difference when I think about how I learned Windows and Linux and Unix. Like, I look back on looking at my experiences and how I learned Unix. It was because someone dropped off a bunch of Solaris servers brand new in the box and was like, yeah, like, have at it. And I'm like, what? Huh? And I had to do all the research and, get the OS going from the ground up. And, back in the day, we had VI, and there was no arrow keys in VI, right? Like, and that's how you had to configure the system from scratch. I also feel like in a Windows environment, looking at a Windows admin who I greatly respect, whose name is also Adam, by the way, had to build the iron, like get the iron in the server room, put Windows on it, and from the ground up, build Active Directory.
Yep.
Even just being next to Adam and talking with him at lunch, I learned a ton. And I'm sure his experience was awesome because he was setting up from scratch. Now I feel like, I guess the point of my question was like, I see you can just like go point, click, like servers come up and it's magic and I can deploy some configurations. And I feel like we're missing that foundational knowledge, which leads me to, in that long-winded explanation, and I apologize for taking the spotlight away from Adam, but that when we, as Active Directory administrators, try to understand some of the security problems that are inherent in the environment, that those are largely ignored and not addressed today. Is that one of the fundamental issues, or what other issues lead to the situation we're in, where 90% of the enterprises today are Active Directory, and maybe, if we're lucky, 3% truly understand how to secure it and lock it down?
Sure. So there's, this as we were both talking about in different ways, right? This point-and-click deployment environment that's primarily template-driven and one or two click away from deploying an image that somebody else has configured is problematic because you don't really get in there, get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves, and figure it out. And either of the two atoms, right, in your example, either myself or the gentleman you were talking about, right, we both have that experience coming from having done it, as you were talking about and alluding to. When you don't do it, you're trusting and relying on somebody who's doing it for you. And if those master images and those cloned instances are not secured from the get-go, right, we have risk, as you were talking about. And I think probably the areas that we miss out on when you don't do it yourself, you don't apply best practices like implementing a least privilege administrative model, right? How do we know that the system's locked down because we're controlling access by delegating responsibility, really carving up who does what? In Linux and Unix, you'd have a root user, which you almost never log in as, if at all. You have normal user accounts, and you have a sudo command of some kind or a sudo capability to augment your level of access when required, right? And why don't we apply that same concept in Windows? Well, we do, but most people don't think about doing it. And as a result, we wind up with boxes that are very, very loosely controlled and very tight instead of very tightly controlled. And so those kind of things become problematic, and it goes back to the fundamentals, right? We talked about lack of knowledge of OSI models or the OSI model rather, lack of knowledge of things like basic TCP/IP networking structures and how we deal with that and why it's not being taught. We should be teaching that along with the basic blocking and tackling of the top 10 or top 20 things you need to do to be secure in an enterprise environment, whether it's Windows-centric or not. I mean, for years we had that divide where it was the Linux or Unix world, it was the Microsoft world. And while that still exists and you often hear about that, the reality is the best practices that keep us secure in the Linux Unix world, almost without exception, are translatable to the Windows world. Whether or not they're command line driven or they're GUI based is irrelevant. The conceptual ideas, right, still make sense. And when we think about how we apply that hard-won knowledge to all platforms and train people and educate them to do that, we become better. When we assume that it's silo-based and we don't share that tribal knowledge, we suffer from the negative outcomes, which are lack of secure, in this case, infrastructure, and directory services that are wide open and vulnerable to attack. We should be locking down secure administrative hosts, sorts of stuff, right?
I'm going to stop you there and address the issue of administrator versus regular user. It was explained to Michael and I really liked this explanation. That doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but that in an Active Directory environment, every user has an explicit level of trust. If you are a user in Active Directory, by default, you are trusted to some level. It is that trust, Larry, are you shaking your head already? It is that trust that is exploited by bad guys, by people like Larry, to take over the Active Directory domain. Do you agree with that? And if you do, how do we solve that issue? I know that's a hard question. I apologize.
I agree with it, and I agree with it provided the following is true. And the way we solve it is by dealing with what I'm about to say is true, which is if we haven't really implemented the least administrative model, or least privilege model I spoke about, which the idea would be that every user, you're right, every user implicitly has a certain level of trust associated with their account. There's no doubt about it. As a default user in an Active Directory environment, I'm given rights to do certain things. The question is, have those rights been vetted, controlled, contained with policy-based administration, whether it's group policy-based and or software policies on top of it, things like app locker to constrain and control what software can run. A lot of different things we can get into ultimately as prescriptions. But if we lock down what the base user is able to do, tightly constrain that model. Listen, the U.S. government, for that matter, spending government on the planet, is able to do it. Military capabilities and networks are able to do it. Corporate environments that are highly regulated are able to do it. It's not as if it's not an achievable goal, but it requires a different level of commitment to management and user configuration and user provisioning from the ground up. And if the company or the entity is not willing to invest the time to create the resources and train the individuals to do it correctly, then we get what we have, which is a wide open environment where Larry or anybody who's looking to exploit those trusted users can walk right through the door. And the perfect example is, instead of going about giving users less control to their desktops to solve problems like software not deploying properly or not allowing users to have full administrative rights to the desktop to solve problems that involve permissions and the ability to do things in the corporate environment, we should lock down the corporate desktop, and we should find ways to train our IT professionals to ensure that they're steeped in the knowledge of troubleshooting and the knowledge of how to deal with those issues, so that the answer to the question, I can't get Microsoft Office or whatever it is, Adobe Acrobat, whatever, but the software involved, I can't get it to run. So I'm going to give the user full admin privileges to let them deal with that from the help desk perspective. And I'm not saying that because I want to say that all help desk professionals don't do the right thing. Quite honestly, most of them probably do on a regular basis. But if the corporate overarching answer to the question, how do we solve the problem, is the quickest and fastest way, which is grant full privileges, then we wind up with wide open environments that are easily exploitable.
Adam,
and trust is unfortunately exploited.
I don't disagree that privileges to the user's workstation is most certainly an issue, and there are ways of dealing with that that are better than just saying, well, they have admin because I can't figure it out, which I think is a summary of what you were just saying.
Right.
But in the domain, if I'm a domain user, as Larry well knows, just my domain user, regardless of whether I have admin in my machine or not, I can enumerate all of the resources within the domain, the shares, the computers, the service accounts. What else, Larry?
The workstations.
All the workstations.
Yep. In many cases.
Services they're running, things of that nature.
In most cases. In most cases.
Yeah. Now, is that
correct.
something that can be locked down further? Because that's often step one. Once an attacker gains a foothold on a Active Directory workstation, the first thing they do is say, okay, like, make me a map, which is what's the
Bloodhound.
Bloodhound does for you automatically, right? Basically says, yep, here are the computers, here are the services, here are the service accounts, here are the users, here are your domain admin users. Those are ones you should look for.
Yep,
and does that automatically.
Here's where those domain admins have logged in, and here's how what the steps you need to go to get to be able to find credentials for that domain admin. As they put it, 6 degrees of separation from domain admin.
Yeah.
It's like
so how do we
playing the Kevin Bacon
Right.
game?
It's like,
do we have controls?
right. It's like back
with,
to bacon. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Do we have controls in Active Directory to help us with that inherent systemic problem?
So the reason I'm sighing is it's a double-edged sword when you answer a question like this. So in theory, do we have the capability to lock that kind of stuff down? We do, but the problem becomes, and Larry, I'm sure, is aware of this, right? The problem becomes on the flip side is that we reduce the level of usability and functionality to, in some cases, to a degree that it becomes exceedingly difficult for us to do other things, and other services and other capabilities may not work the right way.
I'll call it unusable. How's that?
Yeah.
We may be able to configure it.
I'm trying to avoid just making that statement, but it becomes right. It becomes so locked down that it's almost impossible for us to get anything else done.
Right.
And
I
it's
need
the
access
age-old-
to a network share. Well, tell me what shares are out there so I can pick. No, you just got to know like what share you want access to, right?
Yeah.
Is that
Exactly.
Well, yeah, right. You either play the guessing game or you don't get in. But you know, it becomes that question of managing. I guess it's usability versus risk, right? It's probably the easiest way to talk about it. And I think there is that middle ground. Everybody strives to find it, but I think what we're talking about is the fact that many companies don't try to err on the side of caution, but rather err on the side of not inconveniencing the users in that discussion. And as a result, they wind up leaving it too open. And that becomes the problem.
Yep. And I think about one of the ways that you could restrict which user could log into which workstation. And then that becomes potentially a problem on any of the workflow or how the workstations and such are used in any
Sally's
organization.
out today, and so I'm going to just log into her workstation with my ID and use hers because my computer's in for service.
Yep, or any of those types of things. Or so then you start opening it to, well, that Larry can log into any workstation in the department.
Yep.
And then what happens when I work from another department for a different day, or I'm going to help someone do this other thing, or I'm in a conference room and then I can't log in there. And yeah, it becomes about inconveniencing the users.
Interesting.
It does, and that becomes the pivot point, unfortunately, for most organizations, because, like I said, in the military and government areas that I do work in and the customers I have there, it's usually a very different conversation because it's highly compartmentalized. So there, it's the exact opposite. If you're not constraining users and locking them into certain environments because of confidential management of information, you run into other issues. And so that becomes the overarching driving force. And this now becomes a byproduct of that. So things are much more locked down. But in most corporate entities, as you said, it's more about convenience than it is anything else. And that's not a bad thing, but it does become a kind of a weight that we have to drag behind us as administrators, because now we're constrained by the fact that we can't cross certain lines and lock things down a certain way because it becomes unusable in the light or in the face of the fact that we're trying to enable users to be more productive by moving around and doing all sorts of things in different areas all at once.
Adam, what are some of the things you recommend to help secure an Active Directory environment from people like Larry?
Lack of keyboard access for Larry would be a good start. I suppose.
It's a great answer.
Aside from taking his keyboard away, but, but things that we can do.
I managed to work on trying to break one of my fingers the other day, so we're halfway there, or at least 1/10 of the way there.
I did hear the knife story as we were getting started that you were talking about behind the scenes, so it sounds like you did a good job. But aside from obviously just the standard things of reduce and restrict access to open points that are not monitored, in terms of administrative access. I think there's probably three categories, right? At the high level, I mentioned one already in some of the comments I was making earlier, going with a least privilege administrative model to the best of our abilities, as we've been talking about, lock down and prevent access across the entire breadth and depth of the organization to the extent possible without rehashing that discussion we just had. Looking for that balance, right? But I think implementing secure administrative hosts, one of the things that I often find as I go into companies, I do a lot of audit work. When I go into companies and I find that there's a lot of workstations that, as we were just talking about, people will roam around and just sit down and use because it's convenient or it's easy because I'm in here looking for this piece of information and this person is not here. I'll just log on real quick and do what I need to do and log off. If we don't implement secure administrative hosts and have dedicated spaces that are tightly controlled and monitored where administrative functions happen, then we open up the possibility that people will either be forgetful and open up liabilities and security holes as a result, or leave unattended workstations running that have administrative access that somebody can walk up to or potentially gain remote access into. Yeah. And then I think securing the domain controller attack surface. That's what?
I was going to say that's just not a Windows problem.
Oh no, that's an across the board every kind of operating system.
Yeah, I was just like when I was a pen tester, that was kind of like my MO. I would just find stuff that was already logged in. Yeah, and that's because it's such
an easy way to do it. Absolutely.
I'm lazy.
Because people tend to walk away and not think about those things, right? And we don't think about that. But I think generically that helps us to be more secure. And then specific back to the Active Directory, I think locking down the directory, or rather the domain controllers. We do have technology and have had since Windows 2000 approximately in one form or another, over 7 or 8 iterations of the OS now, things like read-only domain controllers being deployed into areas that potentially we can't physically and logically lock down and secure. So that way we're not exposing users and credentials and things of that nature to somebody taking over that box in a remote office and pushing changes back up from outside the main security perimeter. We're only pushing changes down from inside the security perimeter, and they're locked down. We won't accept changes coming back the other way. And nobody can get, even if they steal the box physically, let's say hypothetically, or hack the box and steal the account database, everything's encrypted. The chance of them finding anything that's really of any significant value is minimal at best.
Now,
so
Adam,
things like that would be...
ask you is, you do some of these investigations, or audits rather, I should say. Do you find that more Active Directory shops are embracing and deploying LAPS, or do you see that as something that hasn't increased? And in a follow-on question, like what's your take on LAPS as a security measure?
So I'd say it's probably, just trying to think, I'd say I come across it often, but I wouldn't say that it's so prevalent that everybody that I talk to, everybody that I interact with is dealing with it. But I do think it's probably becoming a little bit more common than it may have been in the past. So I'd say it's probably on the rise overall, I would say. I think overall, I think it's a good idea. Let's put it that way. And I think using solutions like that tend to lead to more security, more risk management, more oversight, more awareness, which circles back to trying to reduce risk, and over time, if you're doing it properly, mitigates the common sense things you should be doing to be more secure, locking them down or dealing with them or whatever you're going to do. I think if you get those 5 or 10 things in the 80-20 rule dealt with on a regular basis, and you're knocking off those really big ticket items that cause a lot of grief, you're able to manage those security concerns more effectively. And I think over time, you shrink that attack surface, which is really what dealing with locking down domain controllers and things like that ultimately becomes, and it's all about.
Adam, with respects to monitoring, what's your recommendations on not logging enough, logging too much, and then how do you know if you're logging the right things? And that could be security or not security, right? Like there's a lot of great things from logs that aren't necessarily security related.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's huge amounts of stuff we can learn that are beneficial to us across the organization that are not necessarily directly security related. I think I'm of the opinion, I'm probably in the minority, to be honest with you, from what I hear from my customers and students and other professionals in the industry. I'm one of those people that doesn't feel you can log too much. I think certainly there is garbage you can log that gets in the way of things if you're not understanding what you're doing and what you're seeing and what you want to find. But I'm of the opinion that I think the more information you have access to as an aggregated data feed or set of sources you can bring through a SEM system or whatever you're doing to bring the data in, that today with the advent of BI data visualization and data analytics tools across the environments that we have. I think you can deal with larger data flows. I think 5, 10, 20 years ago, NetFlow was overwhelming in and of itself without all the possibilities you could achieve with other technologies, or SFlow, or whatever you wanted to use. It was open source or vendor specific, because we got so much information, we had to cull through it manually. It was very difficult to figure out what was there, and tools that are now really helping us to look for hidden patterns in the data are becoming the gold mine that we have to think about as IT and security professionals, that we have to spend time in. So I'm of the opinion, I think we need to log as much as possible, but I think we then need to figure out how to understand what that data tells us in ways that are impactful and not wasting our time trying to chase purple unicorns, right, that aren't really there. But I think the more data you have, the more better decisions over time, and the more analytical you can be with regards to that.
Larry, Michael.
If that makes sense.
Questions? It does. Questions for Adam?
Yeah.
I can't think of any.
Adam, parting words, advice for, let's go with advice for security professionals that are coaching their Microsoft Windows Active Directory administrators to up their game and conform to these. I mean, they're not even so much laundry lists as they are like a longer list, but like there's a list of maybe 5 to 10 things. How do we get active? What's the recommendation to get Active Directory administrators the knowledge that we have in security about kind of those 5 to 10 things? Laps being one of them, right?
Right. So I think number one, they need to do it and not let other people do it for them. So I think we often fall into the trap of, as either junior administrators or people that are not necessarily line of business owners or are not on the hook to be the go-to, that we fall into the shadow of those people, and we're not allowed to do a lot of the things that they do, and we only benefit from them after the fact. At least I see that quite a bit, right, in working with a lot of my customers, that they have larger teams, but only 1 or 2 senior engineers are really doing a lot of that work, and everybody else is just benefiting and managing after the fact. And so I think allowing and really mentoring, as we talked about, and coaching along the way to ensure that everybody understands how to do what we're doing and make them do it. Don't just talk about it. I don't go in as a consultant oftentimes when I'm hired by companies and exclusively do all the work in a black box fashion. We can do that, and we all know in our industry that there's an element of that. But the reality is I try to go in and bring that team along with me, have them sit with me, watch me do it, have them do at my direction the things that need to be done. I'm on the hook. I'm responsible to the customer for ensuring it's done the right way, but I have the latitude to ensure it gets done, not that I have to do it a certain way. And my way is I'd rather bring that team along and make them more knowledgeable, because then I don't have to spend a lot of time fixing their messes and fixing their problems on a regular basis. I could spend more time helping them to be better over time as I invest time with that customer. So I think sharing that knowledge and making that knowledge more accessible is probably the key thing I would recommend. Out beyond that, I think great documentation breeds great environments in terms of the ability to be able to understand how to identify things that are out of place. And I often find, as I'm sure many of you do, that when you deal with customers or deal with solutions and situations and scenarios over the years, as you think back on them, that you've been involved with, that bad documentation or lack of clear documentation often sits at the heart of a lot of the problems we're asked to address after the fact. So I think fixing that and working on that is also a vital area that you spend time on to get better at.
Holy crap,
and
Adam.
I think always having that desire to learn.
It's been way too long since I've heard someone come on the show and in a security context say lack thereof or poor documentation is one of our issues. And wow, thank you for that. That reminder.
It's a good reminder.
Yeah, it's a good reminder.
I will also follow up on that. If you're going to have some really great documentation, make sure you put it someplace that, principle of least privilege, don't let everyone look at your documentation, because depending on how good that documentation is that I'm going to want to look at it, and I will often find very interesting, juicy tidbits
in the documentation. That's a great point.
Yeah,
great follow on to another great point.
Don't put it on a wiki with that requires no credentials to gain access to.
Because it's just documentation.
It's just documentation. Oh, look, usernames and passwords. Great, thanks.
Yeah. Well, if it's not even that, it's
System configuration.
Holy crap! Like this is the lay of the land right here. This is how it all came together.
Especially with something that they had to make work. Which means forget security, just bring it together and document it later and fix it.
That's the crap that I tend to document because it's like, holy shit, I got to remember this. I got it working. I got to remember that. And I got to document how I did it so that when I go back and make it secure, I can try to not break it.
Wait, when you go back and make it secure?
Yeah, exactly. Keith,
the other thing that documentation I think lends to as well is not only the fact that somebody had to take the time to think about it and write it, but then if you ever do updates or if you make changes, making sure that you update the documentation accordingly is super important. But also, it allows you to do just that, Paul. It's I meant to change this flag here. I've got a to-do item in this code that I've got a sample of that I actually need to go back and change in production. Documentation, the written word, right, has literally changed us from the dark ages to where we are today. And people have almost lost that sense of value that they get from actually writing things down in their environment. And then from there, sharing that knowledge with new members of the team, new people that just got hired. If somebody leaves, but you've got all of their documentation, we have a problem in hiring qualified people in this industry in general, right? If we just simply had them spend more time documenting everything they were doing, we could bring junior people in and know that they're still going to be successful in the role because they have the playbook.
And what Keith reminded me of was when I was learning to program and realized that good documentation and a good comment in the code is not just about how you did it, but it's why you did it that's more important, right? And that's what leads to great documentation.
As opposed to the comments that say, I don't know why it works, but don't touch it.
Yep.
Well, those are important too.
Or why did I do this? I was really drunk at the time. Because I've seen those.
If you don't understand this, iterate, or if you try to fix this and fail, iterate this number one more time. And so it's like, you know how many people have tried before you and failed. So the way to solve that is to include all of the resources that you actually went and read before you failed on solving that problem, so that the next person that tries to come and fix it understands all of the work that was done before you.
Adam, one of the things that I love about our conversation just now is that even just that end piece has got us all talking and discussing and sharing stories, which means it resonated with us, which in all likelihood is going to resonate very well with our listeners and cause discussion and thoughtfulness as well. So Adam, for that and all of the knowledge you shared today, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I just want to throw one more thing out that I thought was also important to add. I think the other key piece, right, aside from the two we already identified, is having a non-production environment. I'll call it a lab. You can call it anything you'd like, but essentially a QA or dev area. Set up something firewalled off and secured from everywhere else where you can go and practice what you want to do and get better at, because then when you go and deal with it in production, you're less likely to do all the things we just talked about incorrectly and do the things we did talk about doing the right way. But it helps you to also build better documentation by figuring it out offline and then really getting it right before you go do it. So I like the fact we can virtualize or do these in such a variety of different ways today that we didn't really have access to years ago. And it's so easy that when I point that out to customers or I talk about it with students and they're like, oh, I never thought about that. I could just run VirtualBox and set up my own little environment and do my own thing. And then I can go back to work and really figure out and talk about it there. I think it's such a strong and empowering way to spread that knowledge that we often overlook the obvious. And I think that's one of the most important things as well.
Yeah. When I do it, I do it in production.
Yeah. And I will. So I'll also add a caveat to that, much like I did with the documentation. Don't reuse your production passwords in your dev environment, because typically that dev environment is not well secured because you're still figuring out how to secure it before you put it in production. And I love targeting dev environments because wide open.
You can tell when you're listening to this, like, yeah, Larry's a full-time pen tester. Totally get that.
He's been there and done that more than once.
Yep.
Well, twice as they say, practice like you fight. So
right. Yeah, true.
As Adam is putting it, practice like you fight. Build your lab, make it work, document.
Yep. Adam, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly. It was wonderful having you back.
Thank you, guys. Always a pleasure. Always welcome the opportunity and look forward to the next time we could spend some time together.
Yes. Come back anytime. And don't forget to visit itpro.tv/Security Weekly. Check them out. As an individual, you can subscribe and get access to 3,300 hours of training. If you're an organization, you can buy a subscription for multiple employees and get access to the same great training. So make sure you go do that. With that, we're going to take a short break, come back with our next feature interview. Rebecca Brown, did I get that right? Rebecca, is that her last name? Yes, Rebecca Brown. Whew, I was sweating that one. Is going to come on next, so stay tuned. Don't go anywhere.